Hola, buenas tardes a todos.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Well, we've given 10 minutes of courtesy. Thank you very much for being here in this rainy evening. Well, we are here, but I think that our author deserves it. That we are all here. We're here to present his last work, Arderás en la Tormenta, White River Burning. I don't know if you have had the chance of reading it. This will be a dialogue, okay? I'll speak to him, but I don't want it to be a dialogue between two persons, okay? So you just raise up your hand and we'll keep talking, okay? Because maybe I have questions to ask, but maybe your questions are much more interesting than mine. So I don't want to be the only one who asks questions, okay? And I would like to ask him, first of all, about his detective.
Okay?
Yeah.
Perfect. No, pensaba que no.
No, I thought that the translation wasn't working. Okay, so I would like to ask him about the detective that made him become famous here in Spain, that has appeared in some novels, David Gurney, and how he is able to solve the mysteries of the novels. What's the secret behind Gurney?
The basic central thing with Gurney is that he seems like a complex character, but he's really pretty simple. Gurney is about curiosity. Gurney wants to know what's going on. He wants to know the truth. He wants to get to the bottom of things. And that's the single greatest motive in his life. And it's what drives him. He's also a pretty smart guy, so that combination of being totally focused on finding out the truth and kind of having the mental power to pursue it, that pretty much sums up the guy. He's got a lot of, I'd say, sort of human weaknesses. He's not a very warm person. He has areas of conflict with his wife.
Ay, no, sí.
So, because, you know, she's very much more into enjoying the moment. She wants to paddle the canoe, and she'd like him to be paddling the canoe with her. Gurney has to make a bit of an effort to do that kind of thing. He's much happier in his own mind than he is in, the happy world of nature.
Lo que yo no entiendo es cómo su mujer sigue con él.
I don't understand how his wife is still with him.
Yeah, this is a mystery to a number of people, because his wife and Gurney are very different people. She's much warmer. There's a whole lot of differences between them. But the thing is, even though they're remarkably different, they love each other. For some reason, each of them is the most important person in the world to the other, and it doesn't seem to matter very much that they think differently.
Dices que...
Will you say that they love each other and that they are the most important person in the world for the other? But I disagree with that. Because every time that a story starts, for Dave, the most important person is a dead person, is a corpse.
But and it's not even the corpse that's the most important thing. Gurney's focus is on how did that corpse get there? It's not so much a warm desire to respond to someone's pain. What it is with Gurney is trying to understand. He wants to get to the truth of the thing, and let me put it this way: his wife is the most important living person to him.
Okay. En eso sí que estamos de acuerdo.
We agree on that then. Maybe we could have started with to know what the novel is about. But I'm going to ask him now, because we haven't done it. What can we find in this novel?
That's a big question. What can we find in the novel?
Es muy difícil para un escritor.
It's very difficult for a novel to summarize his own book, isn't it?
Is. Oh, I tell you, I can summarize it sort of, because there was a quote that I came upon that gave me the starting idea for the book, and it goes back to the late 17th century. It's a quote from a book by Cotton Mather, who was a Puritan leader in the Massachusetts colony and in America during the time of the Salem witch trials, where mostly women, some men, but mostly women, were being accused of witchcraft and hanged. And there's a quote in the book from someone who was a bit concerned about not only that was happening, but another element of it, which was that, well, I'll paraphrase the quote and you'll understand. It was, there's no social calamity so great or so awful that some evil person can't find a way of taking advantage of it for their own selfish purposes. In a way, that's what the novel is about. There's an awful lot of social turmoil in the novel. There's conflict between groups of people. There's an element of racism that gets in there and so forth. But what the real story is about is how someone takes advantage of that. How somebody is willing to manipulate that situation for their own ends in a way that turns out to be pretty disastrous.
Es un libro en el...
It's a book where the way of writing is highly pessimistic about the role of the media. I don't know if you wrote it before Trump came to the White House. Maybe you had an intuition. I mean, where does that pessimistic feeling comes from, and how is the U.S. living these fact with the media and the relationship with of the White House with the media?
What's going on with the media, I think, is complex right now, and in a sense, there's nothing absolutely new. I mean, journalism has never been a perfect art. There's always been some element of bias, some element, some slant, some second agenda. That's always been there to some extent. But something else is happening, and I think it has something to do with the internet. The internet has allowed some marginal journalists to create their own little worlds and to cater to people's fears, to cater to their resentments. And it seems to me what's happening in the media right now, and perhaps the most bizarre thing is this, what we've come to call fake news, in that there seems to be less and less interest in what's really true. And it seems that a lot of media entities are focused on whatever it takes to get and hold an audience. Now, conflict has always been a big part of media coverage. Conflict and to some degree of sensationalism. But that seems to be accelerating now. That, in the combination of that with less reliance on objective fact, audiences seem to be being brought together based on their resentments. I mean, there's something basically tribal about human beings. I mean, we're to some extent tribal creatures. And there's a good side, a natural side to that. We like to be with people who share our view of things. But it gets a little bit poisonous when the essence of the tribe turns into hatred of other tribes. And I have a feeling that some of that is starting to happen right now. It's not so much that people are disagreeing with each other, they're hating each other. And I think the media is to some extent complicit in that.
¿Qué papel?
What role or what responsibility do you think that citizens have in all this?
Well, that's a very modest thing. I mean, because what can I really do? I mean, I can make an effort to find out what's true. I might even make an effort to look at media sources that I tend not always to agree with. You know, one of the problems with us, with me, is that I tend to look at sources of news that I'm comfortable with. I tend to want to hear what I believe. I tend to want to be reinforced. And maybe that's a problem. Maybe instead of looking to be reinforced, I should look a little bit more to be challenged. And maybe I should take the time to look a little deeper. You know, an awful lot of media coverage is not only sensational, but it's remarkably superficial. And I don't blame that. It's not that the media is an evil thing, trying to be superficial in order to make us ignorant. That's not what's happening. What's happening is that there is a basic economy in that industry that relies on audiences. And most audiences don't want enormous amounts of detail. But maybe if you want to talk about being a responsible citizen, maybe it involves absorbing a little bit more detail than I might normally be inclined to do. I think being a responsible citizen in this situation involves maybe a little bit of work, maybe a little bit of discomfort.
Estoy esperando a que acabe el traductor.
I'm waiting for the translator to end up, because otherwise we would get overlapped and he can't translate the questions into English. So we're very thankful for that. I have to confess, I don't know if you are dressed up like you are today, but you look more like a priest rather than someone that has his head full of murderers. Well, I mean, priests, let's say well, there's plenty of blood in the Bible. The Bible is one of the most cruel books that has been ever written. So your head, your brain of murderer, of someone that is able to think about crimes, is something that doesn't have nothing to do with the way that, as you are dressed up with these blue eyes that convey such feeling of peace. So,
well, I tell you, the first thing that comes to mind is that when I was a little kid growing up, my mother's fondest hope would be that I'd be a priest. But in fact, I think she had rather ambitious hopes. I wouldn't just become a priest, I'd be a bishop. But in terms of the content of the books, for me, it's not so much about the awfulness in the book. It's about how the awfulness is dealt with. You know, there are a lot of thrillers, mystery novels, and so forth that I don't particularly like to read. And one aspect of some mystery novels that kind of repels me is when it's very much from the point of view of the killer. And what the killer does and how he attacks people and the pain he causes is very much present in the novel. That doesn't interest me, and it's not something that I want to do. I mean, if you're familiar with the Dave Gurney novels, you know that virtually everything awful that happens a little bit out of sight. And generally, people come to it, they may describe it later, but you don't have people getting sliced up in front of your face. So that's not my interest. My interest is not the awfulness. My interest is how the awfulness is dealt with. And the process of uncovering what's there under it, what were the motives, not only who did it, but why did they do it, and pursuing that as far as Dave Gurney can pursue it. And it's that pursuit that interests me. It's not the awfulness.
Sí, pero
yes, but we are accustomed to blood. In the US, for example, it's much worse to see a breast on TV rather than extremely violent scenes. That's the point there, okay? So, I'm not speaking about blood when I speak about that. I mean, blood is not so dangerous or to slice a corpse, like you've said. But I think that it's the fact that a writer gets into that evil process to make his murderer to do what he has done, I think is much more dangerous. It's much more dangerous to try to understand the murderer, to understand why he has done these things. I don't know if you agree with that.
I guess what I'm saying, if I'm understanding the question right, it isn't so much a matter. I'm not so much interested in getting into the murderer's mind in terms of any kind of sympathy with why this.
No sympathy. No. Just this is first to explain it, para explicarlo.
Just to explain it, explain why a murderer does what he does. At the end of the day, David has to understand the motivation of the murderer in order to discover him.
I think there's a process that goes back and forth. In other words, Gurney makes some advances, he gains some understanding, the understanding takes him a little further. And it's a step-by-step thing. Okay, I understand. I think I understand why this guy did this. But if he did do it for that reason, then certain circumstances should exist. Now let me go see if those circumstances exist. It's a matter of trying to get to a total truth of what's happened.
Usted empezó a escribir muy tarde.
You started writing very late. You started to write books very late.
No le estoy llamando.
I'm not saying that you're old, okay?
¿Por qué alguien
I'm looking around the room, and I'm pretty sure I'm the oldest guy in the room, but
maybe. Usted empezó a...
But you started to write when a little bit later, so to speak. Saramago, for example, started to write very late, and he was awarded with a Nobel Prize. But normally, writers start a little bit, they start before with some attempts. What made you start writing with that first novel?
Well, when I was in the advertising business for many years, and when I retired from the advertising business, I had this urge to do something totally, completely different. I was a writer in the advertising business, but I wanted to do something completely different. And that turned out to be not these novels, that turned out to be making furniture. And for about 10 years after I left the advertising business, I cut wood and screwed things together, and I made furniture. I made pretty much all the furniture for our house. I made the furniture for my kids' houses. I did, all of that stuff. When we moved from the city up to the Catskill Mountains in upstate New York, I started reading a lot of mystery novels, and I got quite fascinated by them. I really discovered that I'd rather read mystery novels, specifically detective mystery novels, than anything else. And in the course of reading them, it occurred to me that I understood the structure. I knew how these things were being put together. I mean, it was almost like furniture. I could figure it out. And I think one night at dinner, I was talking to my wife, and I love explaining things, you see. So I was explaining in painful detail everything I knew or thought I knew about the structure of detective novels. You see, this is how it works. This is how it, blah, 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 blah. And I probably went on a bit too long with this. And finally, she looked at me and she said, well, if you know so darn much about it, why don't you try and write one? And okay, so I decided maybe I would try to write one. And 2 years later, I came back to her and handed her a manuscript. And I said, well, what do you think? And she kind of liked it. She said, yeah, this is good. I think this is actually a little bit better than some other things I've read. I think this is not bad. So that's how it came about. But then I had no belief this thing would ever be published. I mean, I didn't start writing any of this stuff till I was over 65. I mean, that's an odd time to start something. But so I she said, you ought to try to get it published. And I sent out an inquiry letter to, I think it was 54 agents, mostly in New York City. And one of them sent a letter back to me saying that she'd like to see the manuscript. So I sent her the manuscript. 2 weeks later, she sold it to Random House. And that's how that started. And then that book got sold all over the place. I think now we just got our 31st language publisher. And so that's how that started. And that book has been sold all over the world in remarkably different kinds of cultures. So David Gurney, at the end of that book, was so depressed by what happened in it. He felt so miserable about the crime that had been committed and by who it had been committed. And he was virtually on the edge of suicide. He's sitting in a car next to his house. He's at the end of this thing. He is so depressed he can't even go into the house. And that's like the end of Dave Gurney. That was my idea of the ending. And then my agent said, do you think he might be involved in maybe some more mysteries? Do you think David might, be around for a while? And I thought, well, I hadn't thought of that, but I guess. And she said, well, maybe we could just bring the music up a little bit at the end, and not have him unable to get out of his car.
Así que le tiene que agradecer.
So you have to be thankful to your wife because she cheered you up. She made you bold to do that. So maybe why do I think that the relationship between Dave and his wife is so awful? I mean, I don't think that they really love each other.
Yes, they do.
Pues yo soy la mujer de Dave y no.
If I was Dave's wife, I couldn't do that. He's getting red. I don't know if you can see it from there, but he suddenly thought, well, my wife and myself, I'm Dave, my wife is Dave's wife.
Ahí está su mujer aquí. Yo creo que
Oh, his wife is back there. I think he's looking at her.
A lot of people, it's funny. When my wife reads the books, she has some problems with Madeline. She thinks, Madeline is not necessarily the most pleasant person in the world. She thinks, that Madeline can be a bit bitchy and so forth. See. And then this horrible thing happens, which is our friends who read the books come into the house and say, "Oh, Madeline is you."
No. It's her?
Yes. It's her.
Usted viene del mundo de la publicidad.
So you come from the world of advertising, from the part that is behind advertising, not from the 20 seconds ads that appear on television. Is it a very cruel word? Well, it's a very cruel word. It's a very cruel world, and I think that the behaviors that you've seen during all these years working in the advertising world, maybe they could be a good argument for many murderers.
My advertising career was what it was, but for some reason I tend not to talk about it. I've had kind of these three careers in my life. I did the advertising thing for a long time. I built furniture for 10, 12 years. And I've been writing the books now for 11 years. By the way, that makes me 76. So I've been writing the books for 11 years now. And every one of the books has been, I've given to my kids. And I mean, my kids are are grown people, but I've given them to my kids. My kids love the books. All of the furniture I made, I've either given it to them or they've seen it. And in 33 years, I never showed them one damned ad I ever wrote. So, I mean, I guess that maybe says something about my view of my three careers. But I tend not to talk about advertising. It really doesn't interest me much anymore.
Hay algo que siempre se...
Well, there's something that usually women that read a mystery novel think about some male writers, and that is that the protagonists are similar to James Bond or Superman rather than a real detective. But you've made, I don't know if because of your wife, that Dave is somebody that has a little bit of Superman, but we believe his feelings and the feelings that he goes through during these stories. How you can make that?
Well, from one side...
¿O por qué?
Or why? Or why Dave is different to other super detectives in mystery novels?
One reason is that it's the only kind of detective I would want to write about. The idea of a Superman detective and a subservient female somewhere, it just doesn't interest me at all. One of my own convictions is that Dave and Madeline are very much equals. And maybe Madeline is even a little bit more equal than Dave. I mean, that's what interests me. I mean, I don't like Superman detective. I don't like a detective, for example, who gets shot 5 times at the end of a novel, and at the beginning of the next one he's fine. There's got to be some kind of human reality in it, or to me it's not interesting.
Pero acostumbra a pasar.
But it usually happens, especially when detectives have a long life and a long career and they move from one novel to another, to another, to another. Are you afraid of the fact that there comes a time that Dave has gone through so many and many things that he's not, that you can't believe on the next challenge for him as an author?
Often it is, but there's a countervailing force in David. He does, by the way, have problems in some novels that arose in the previous one. And in one of the novels, for example, he gets shot a number of times at the end of it. At the beginning of the next novel, that's very much a part of his situation. He has changed. In the first novel, he would never carry a gun. After he got shot, he carries a gun. So I mean, there are evolutions like that. But you would think that a guy like this, having gone through the sometimes awful experiences that he goes through, that he would just stop doing it. But the key thing about David is that he can't stop doing it. The drive to understand these crimes, the drive to understand what's happening is so strong in him that nothing is going to stop him. If he was killed, he might stop, but nothing short of that.
Okay, so I'd like to speak about the creation process. How do you conceive a novel before writing it? There are writers that make a structure, they make a research, and they stick to that structure. There are writers that know the end, but they go through paths that they don't know until that end. There are writers that know who the evil character is, but they don't know what's going to happen in the novel. How do you conceive that novel, and how is that process until you say, well, I have this manuscript?
Well, one basic thing is that I know a lot about basically what happens before I start to write. And one way of thinking about it, and I sometimes talk about it this way, to me it's like an archaeological process. A crime novel is really 2 novels. there's the story of the crime. There's the criminal. What did he do? Who did he do it to? Why did he do it? How did he try to conceal it? What mistakes might he have made? There's that whole story. And then, as a kind of overlay to that, there's the second story. And the second story is, how does the detective uncover the truth of what's been done? And I think of it sometimes like an archaeologist who walks out into the desert and sees a little thing sticking out of the sand. And okay, see, that's the point in which the detective gets involved. It's what's that thing sticking out of the sand? And he starts to dig around it, and he digs down, and he clears away some sand. And maybe he has some people telling him that he's doing it the wrong way, or that he ought to be looking someplace else. And so there's conflicts immediately with how is he proceeding. But he keeps digging. And maybe as he digs, he discovers something that, oh, I know what this is. But then he discovers something else. Oh, wait, that's not it. See, it's not a straight line. It wiggles. But I think, I don't know how anyone could write a novel like that without knowing what the crime is and how it was done, because that's what the detective is going to discover. And see, in a way, I'm kind of the detective when I'm writing these things. I'm figuring, how would you discover this thing that's been done? So that's kind of how it comes together. But the genesis of the idea, that's something else. See, I'm just talking about structure. The genesis of the idea, I'll give you an example from the first novel, and how that came to be. It had nothing to do with David Gurney. I was thinking about to me, an interesting situation, which in that novel is this guy, Mark Mellery. And Mark Mellery, he starts getting little mail messages that are vaguely threatening, that refer to somebody possibly knowing something about his past. And saying he's had a past he's not particularly proud of, but now he's got a very good life. The idea that I liked was that, how would a person react who had a lot to lose, but had kind of vulnerabilities in his past life that, if they came up, could be a huge problem for him. So it started with that. And I figured, okay, who would that person be who would attack him in that way and want to harm him in that way? Okay. So now we got to get a detective. We got to get somebody who's going to find out what the heck is going on with this. Now, Mark Mellery, in my view, was a very emotional guy. He was scared to death. He was in a panic over these notes he was getting. So it occurred to me, by the way, somewhere along the way in terms of writing novels, somebody once said, the one thing you got to have on every damn page and throughout the novel is conflict. You got to have conflict. So I'm thinking, all right, if Mellery is this nervous, emotional guy, I got to have a super rational, calm, logical detective. See, so that became the core for Gurney, because I wanted something to contrast with this victim. And then I figured, well, I'd like Gurney to be married, right? That'd be a good thing to be married. So I don't want him to be married to a super logical, rational detective. He's got to be married to someone where there's potential for conflict. So all right, Gurney is kind of cerebral, so we'll make his wife very immediate. She's going to be somebody who enjoys the moment, who, today is today. Let's figure out what we're going to do right now. It's 3:00 in the afternoon. What's a good thing to do now? See, that's the kind of wife I wanted him to have. So in a way, that's how these novels grow in my mind. They may start with a character. Okay, we need an opposing character. Okay, how are we going to... That's how Jack Hardwick came to be. Because it occurred to me as I'm writing the novel that Gurney is a very conservative guy. He's very straightforward, probably has pretty short hair, probably wears pretty traditional clothes. probably doesn't get mad, probably isn't very outgoing. Oh, let me give him a cop partner who's rough and vulgar and loud, and that's the core of Jack Hardwick. Rough, prude, loud, but smart, because I don't really like writing about dumb people.
You've told us how you created your characters, but how do you make them move through the story? Of all your novels, which one has given you the hardest job, where you got stuck in somewhere you couldn't advance?
I'm not well, it's funny. I'm not sure I ever got stuck. Maybe I did, and I don't know that I got stuck. And I'll tell you why. I'm not a disciplined daily writer who might, show up at the see how old I am. I was going to say show up at the typewriter, but who might show up at his keyboard and and not be able to think of anything. But maybe my advantage is that I'm totally undisciplined, and I only do what I feel like doing, and I only write when I feel like writing. So maybe I've had all kinds of blocks, but I just thought I was taking a month off. I don't know.
¿Qué es lo más?
What is the most difficult thing for you now? To write such a complete rounded novel where everything is tied off, there are no loose threads. You have to review the manuscript time and time again. Do you have to keep everything in your head and have lots of post-its all over your desk? Do you write summaries of what's happening so that you stay on top of the plot? Because the readers of crime novels are often smarter than the authors, sometimes at least, and they see things that the authors hadn't realized. So how do you keep on top of all that so that your readers don't point things, makes mistakes out to you?
Well, that's an interesting thing. Yes to post-it notes, and yes to, I write with little index cards. I've got, by the way, that's something that I do when I'm writing a novel. I carry index cards around with me all the time, because I get ideas when I'm driving, and I jot things down. And when I've got about 500 index cards, that's when I try to start organizing them and turning them into a plot structure and so forth. So the index cards help in my the plot organization. So I don't have something happening in chapter 35 that's totally impossible based on what happened in chapter 23. That helps, but I make a lot of oversights and a lot of mistakes, and my editor will catch some of them and miss some of them. Then the copy editor, who goes over it in more detail, she catches some of them. And then when I get back a so-called final from the editor and the copy editor, I'll catch more of them. And then they'll go through 3 or 4 actual galley-proof passes, and I'll find more stuff in those. And then when it finally goes to press, I'm scared to death because I assume there's more stuff that I've forgotten. But that's really how it happens. I mean, it's amazing the amount of detail in these things, and sometimes it scares me how much of it I do miss.
La verdad es.
The fact is that it's a pleasure to read your novels because they're so well written. Let me explain that. Sometimes some writers, especially of crime fiction, focus on the plot so much that they forget about writing literature, writing good text. They forget that the text can be beautiful and well constructed, so that from a literary perspective it can be well written and still be a thriller or a crime novel, and keep the reader anxious to turn over the page. And that's something you're able to do. You write a thrilling novel, but it's also very well written.
Well, number one, thank you. But
You're welcome.
But number two, I think I probably also owe a debt of gratitude to my Spanish translator, who I think is quite
Pero en inglés imagino que también.
But but also in English you write very well. I've read the novels in Spanish, of course, in translation, but I'm sure that your English language is very good. Is that just something natural to you, or do you have to make a great effort to keep a novel that's very dense, is also rich linguistic terms? It's not the subject, verb and predicate, full stop, another sentence, subject, verb and predicate, dialogue, response.
Su mujer se lo está pasando.
Your wife is having a great time there in the front row.
I'm not sure how to respond to that. I mean, I think you're very kind to comment favorably on the writing. To me, I don't know. It's just it's a product of my overwhelming talent. That's what it is.
¿Qué aprendió? Nos lo ha contado un poco antes, ¿no?
You've already mentioned a little this process of building furniture that you spent a few years after you retired from your first career, and you learned how to build a structure, but also apart from the structure you also learned things that you can do with your hands. And I'm thinking about murderers again. Because you've got very powerful tools in your carpentry toolbox.
If I'm not mistaken, a couple of years ago when I was between books and trying to think about would I write another one, I have a recollection of my wife saying that, well, why don't you set the next one in the room with your saw? So maybe one of these days, David will combine my hobby with his.
Maybe in the next.
Perhaps in
su proceso de escritor.
In your process of writing, the way that you work as a writer, do you discard a lot of ideas? Do you leave them aside for a later novel? Or are you the one of the writers who thinks, I'm going to put everything I can, I'm going to cram it all in case I don't get any more good ideas?
I think probably I've done a bit of both of that. I mean, I've had ideas that made it onto my little pile of index cards, but then when I start to sort through the thing, there'll be plenty of stuff that doesn't fit anymore. There'll be things. Sometimes I'm in love with an idea that doesn't fit anymore, and then that goes into another manila envelope for future reference. But and my editor, by the way, every once in a while there's something I am in love with. There'll be some character that I really think is terrific, or some little scene that I think is amusing, or whatever. And my editor will from time to time just say, geez, I'm not, we're already up to 450 pages with this thing. I really don't think we need that extra 20 pages on that, see? And by the way, I don't argue with my editor. For some reason, maybe I've just been very fortunate. My editors over the past 10 years have been, remarkably good people. I think of all the suggestions my editors have made, and there have been hundreds, as a matter of fact, because you give them the manuscript, you get back an editorial letter with loads and loads and loads of comments and suggestions, and why don't we get rid of this or change that, and so forth. I think of the hundreds of suggestions I got from my editors, I think I argued with 2.
Oh, ole.
I trust my editors, and if they think something doesn't belong and I'm in love with it, I grit my teeth and say the hell with it, and out it goes. Maybe that's why the novels are good. I trust my editors.
Well, I've read your novels, and it's true that I would give Madeline a kiss.
Quizá podemos hacer que Dave...
And perhaps we could even have Dave break his leg and be stuck at home. And Madeline, she's a smart one. She can solve his case.
That's been suggested by people that maybe Gurney could end up in maybe end up in a rehab for 3 months, and the next murder could, be up to Madeline, but I haven't quite gotten to that yet.
En sus novelas.
In your novels, there's also a lot of social criticism. In a lot of the text, you bring us face to face with a situation that we don't like to look at. Do you believe in committed writers? Is that something that you do on purpose? I imagine you do. We're making us face up to things we don't like, so that we see here is the dark side, not just of the murder and the thriller, but all those other subplots in the novel. Here you have the dark side of the world, of how we are as human beings and as a society.
Anything that's in the novels is there because, for one simple reason, because I think it's true and it interests me. I've never had the notion that I'm trying to convince anyone of anything. I've never had the notion that I want people to see the truth of this or that. That's not part of my DNA. That's not what I'm interested in. I write about things that I find interesting. I show things that I think are interesting to look at. Sometimes they're negative, sometimes they're positive. But for me, it's about, are they interesting? And do they have something to do with this story, see? Do they have something to do with the story? There's a lot of stuff in my novels that's kind of little subplots and little things that happen. But I think in some way they're all relevant. It's like music, You can have a lot of different themes going on in a piece of music, but they better at the end hang together.
Realmente.
Yes. Do you believe that there are really such evil people in the world, or is the world even worse than your novels depict?
If that's the choice, I would opt for the second.
For the world, por el mundo o por la ficción, por la realidad o por la ficción.
Which one, the reality or the fiction? Which is worse?
Reality. I think reality is much worse than anything I've written.
Muchas veces hay cosas.
I'm a journalist, as you know, and we often have to tell stories, and this of the real life, but if we were to put this in a chapter of a novel, people wouldn't believe it. Our readers wouldn't believe it. But speaking about this difficulty of making your stories credible, in all of the novels that you've written, which is the plot or subplot that's been most complicated for you, that's been hardest for you to convince the reader to believe in it, or even for you to write it?
Well, I can't answer the question about how difficult it is to convince the readers to believe it, because I have no idea what readers believe. But in terms of hard to write, I don't know. You see the problem being my total lack of discipline, and that is that I very rarely write anything that's hard for me to write. So it's very hard for me to say where the greatest effort was. I don't write anything that I find effortful.
¿Le han dicho alguna vez que
Has anyone ever told you, or at least this is my feeling as the reader, has anyone ever told you that your novels are closer to the Scandinavian crime fiction more than the US crime fiction, particularly that what reaches Spain at least?
Yeah, I have heard people say that, in fact, early on, when before I had read Scandinavian crime fiction, I know my agent at one point said that it reminded her of some of the Scandinavian writers. And I personally like them. There's a sort of a Scandinavian writer. I guess Iceland is considered kind of Scandinavian. And I'm not very good at Icelandic pronunciation, but the name looks to me like Arnaldur Indridason. And it's pretty bleak stuff, but I like it.
What else have you got to put David Gurney through? He's done so many things to him. What more is up your sleeve?
I'm starting with my little pile of index cards for a 7th novel, I don't know yet whether I'm really going to write it because I have to be drawn into it. The notion of pushing myself into writing a book doesn't appeal to me. I like the idea that if I wake up in the morning, I'm eager to get to it, as opposed to the way I felt when I worked in advertising. So I have the index cards are now probably about 100. To get to the point of actually writing it, it would get to about 500. So I don't know if I'm there yet, but I have an idea that interests me, and I if I had a bet, I'd say that we're gonna put Dave to work again.
Ahora una con trampa.
So there will be another novel. Good. Do you think that crime novelists or the male writers write differently from their female counterparts?
Oh, I guess so to some extent, except that I don't read that widely. I have a very narrow focus in terms of the kinds of crime novels that appeal to me. And the first cut for me is, well, first of all, no constant gory violence, because I just don't want to read that. The second cut, though, which eliminates an awful lot of mystery novels, is I want it to be from a single perspective. I want to see the world and the process through the eyes of the detective. I don't want to be in a room with the criminal knowing things the detective hasn't found out. And I don't know whether it's just the way my head works or what. I want to see the world through his eyes. And and then I have other little things that get in the way, like the writing itself. I mean, if I find the writing awkward, I mean, that's the end of it. I can't read it. If I find, it's hard to say. I have abandoned so many books in the first 10 pages. It just doesn't feel right to me. It doesn't sound right to me. So in terms of a broad thing, like comparing male detective writers with female detective writers, I probably haven't read enough or broadly enough to say anything that's honest or makes sense.
¿Y usted cree que alguna vez serías...
You said that, would you be able to write about a female detective? Your books are always seen, as you say, through what Dave sees. Do you think you would be able to see the story, the plot, through what a woman sees?
I think I would be foolish to think I could.
Yo no sé si queréis hacerle alguna...
I don't know if there are any questions from the floor. I'm sure there are many of you. You're letting me ask all the questions. I'm sure you've got lots of ideas and comments. Please don't be shy. Anyone? There are some microphones in the room for you to ask your questions. Hello, good evening. Yes, the first thing I want to do is thank you for coming and to congratulate you too for your books, which I love, but for various reasons. I think, as Carmen mentioned, I think they are all very well written, and secondly because you design stories that I feel are very credible, and I also enjoy with all those contrasts between Dave and his wife, because we feel much more in line with them, or with one or other of them. I think these contrasts are very interesting. But having said that, I've got two quick queries to ask you. One is just out of curiosity. When you speak about your manuscripts, what you hand in, is it truly a manuscript, handwritten? Are you using a fountain pen, or are we just calling a manuscript, or are you using a computer instead of a pen and paper? And the second question is whether you feel identified with Dave, because one of the things I'm struck by in your book is that there are always lots of annotations or quotes, and it's not so often when I read crime novels, you go more to the plot and to the events or what's happening in the story. But yet in your books, I always end up underlining lots of quotations and that are going beyond the simple narration of the facts or the suspense of the story. These could be interpretations of what life is like or how to approach different problems in life, and I'd like to know to what extent these correspond to your perspective of life, or whether it's something that's exclusively Dave's own making.
Well, number one, thank you very much. And I would love to have many more readers exactly like you. But to the first question, the manuscript thing, no, I just think it's just a fancy word that I like to apply to my TypeScript. In terms of similarities with Dave, and Dave's basic theories, his ideas about things, yeah, those are mine. That's just a way I have of getting certain notions I have in print. And so, yeah, Dave and I are very much in sync on that stuff. And there's a connection between Dave and myself, but it's not a complete connection. The connection is in how we think, and how how we perceive the world, and what we think is important. That's the link. Dave has a bunch of other qualities that I don't have. First of all, he's a police officer, and I could never be a police officer. I'm terrified of conflict, and people don't call the cops to tell them everything's fine, and so the idea of being a police officer, I couldn't do that. He has a lot of courage. He can deal with very difficult people, and he can do it in a cool way. I don't think I could ever do that. So it's almost as though, yeah, Dave and I share a certain kind of abstract thinking, a love of pattern, but he's a much stronger, bigger guy than I am.
There was another hand raised there at the back. Well, the microphone's getting there. I have a question that's been sent in by Twitter. You know that you can use this hashtag to ask questions on the social media. And I've got a question here that's arrived via Twitter. Now, if this smartphone will let me read it. Campuzano, when is Mexico going to arrive? When's your novel going to get to Mexico? I don't know if he's referring to this one or other novels that are distributed in Latin America.
Para los que no veis, acaba de mirar a Silvia Fernández, que es la jefa de prensa.
For those of you who are not able to see, Silvia is the representative of Rock Editorial, and she'll have to answer that question. But she's answering without a microphone. Okay, so the people watching on the streaming, I still don't know the date when we get to Mexico, but the other novels are already distributed in Mexico. They're available. Are there... Well, okay, we'll find out and we'll let you know in the social media. Forgive me, you now have the floor. I have a very odd question. Perhaps it would be take me a very long time to explain why it, but is a writer always used to magic tricks and prestidigitation and all sorts of conjuring tricks? Is that true of you?
Well, I don't know.
So what?
What sort of conjuring tricks did you...
¿Qué tipo de trucos de prestidigitación tenía?
I'm not sure I understand.
No, she's asking you, le pregunta si usted es aficionado a los trucos de magia.
She's asking if you're fond of magic because of his first novel, I Know What You're Thinking, which is... think of a number, because there's a certain as if it were a magic trick, the techniques used there.
Oh, I see what you mean. Actually, no. I'm not fond of magic because I find it a curious thing. I mean, the device in Think of a Number, it does have that quality, but the only thing that interests me about that is how it was done. I'm not thrilled by the notion of a magic performance. I'm interested in how it was done. That's it. I'm interested in the logic of it, not the flash and dash of it.
¿Tenéis alguna pregunta más? Sí. Uy, qué bien. Por allí hay dos.
Do you have any other questions? We have 2 hands there. There's another one here. Yeah, okay. And another one here. Yeah, we'll pass it right now, okay? Yeah, it's your turn. I'd like to know, because he was saying that these cases have not been related with a criminal investigation, so I would like to know how you document yourself, because everything you explain, at least what we get, we think that it's absolutely credible. I mean, how do you research on that? How do you investigate on that? How is that process? How do you document everything? Because you don't have any contact with this criminal world, so to speak. And another thing that has to do with the detective, how can he do that despite he's so single-minded, so rational? I mean, we feel really attached to him. So I understand Madeline. It's like a teddy bear, so to speak. So it's a feeling that I don't know how he's some kind of vulnerable person, and he's quite smart person. He's a genius, but he has the spot of we like to hug him.
Good. Please keep hugging him. But the question is,
La pregunta.
¿Cómo consigue que un personaje?
How can you make that such a character, such an irrational and such a nasty character? How you can make to have this vulnerable layer, the feeling that you love the character, you feel identified with the detective, and as regards investigation, you don't have any relationship with this world, so how can you do that?
and the research, curiously, is not that difficult. What I did originally when I was writing the first book, I bought 3 textbooks on criminal investigation, the kind of textbooks that are used in police academies to teach cops how to conduct investigations. And they're very thorough, and it's not brain surgery. It's relatively simple stuff once you look at it and see what they're up to. So those books helped a lot. I visited a police academy. I visited a forensic lab, and the things that interested me about those visits to those police areas was not so much the detail, which I could get out of a book, but what interested me was just how they talked, how they discussed what it was they did, and how matter of fact it was. If we're collecting something that's bloody, we do this with it, and we do this. There was a very matter of fact thing about it. So I liked listening to them talk, and picked up some facts too. But it was the tone that I liked. I do happen. It didn't get. It's not part of the research for the novels. I do happen to have a son in law enforcement, but. And I've, occasionally I will ask him about, is this the right word for this or that? But boy, you buy a book on criminal investigation, you can figure out a whole lot of stuff. Thank you.
Tenías el micrófono, sí, y ahora había 2 personas también allí que querían preguntar.
Entrando en temas de escritura.
So in terms of writing, there are 2 types of writers. First of all, we have like Stephen King, for example. He sits down and writes 10,000 words in one day. And you have the writer that changes the same sentence 1,000 times until it's perfect. So what type of writer are you?
Probably neither one exactly. Because of the way I create these things, a certain amount of ideas will go down on these index cards. And then when I try to start to write dialogue or describe a scene, I look at the relevant index cards and I start writing on yellow pads. And generally I discover that I've grossly overwritten, so that when I finally get to type it into the computer, I'm typing from a yellow pad that has at least 2/3 of everything on it crossed out. So at that point, I'm not rewriting. A certain thing has happened on the index card that got a little refined when it ended up on the yellow pad, and then that got edited down to something when it ended up on the computer. And then when my editor gets to it, it gets edited down again, and then when it gets to the copy editor, it gets edited down. But I don't keep rewriting, no. It's that little 3-step process, and that's enough for me. Thank you.
Hola, buenas tardes, John.
Hello, good afternoon, John. First of all, thank you very much for coming to Spain, to Madrid, to visit us and to giving us the chance of being here. The speech, thank you to Karma, thank you to Espacio Telefonica. And my question is the following. As we were speaking about criminal novels and investigation stuff, murders, etc., in Spain, most of the cases, in the case of killers, murderers, are eventually solved. The murderer identifies himself, he turns himself in, but there are some cases that have not been solved. Like, for example, I can't forget about Marta del Castillo. It's a case that it's still pending here in Spain. Do you know that at any of your future novels, your detective, David, could try to figure out what happened with a character like this girl, because the police has been unable to find where she was buried or how her body disappeared? Do you think that through your novel you would be able to create or investigate something about a similar case? Maybe you can discover it. Well, I'm going to put some context on that, okay, just to tell them what this is about, okay? Marta del Castillo was a Spanish teenager from Seville that disappeared. They've never found her corpse. I think that it's between 10 or 12 years that she disappeared. Her corpse has never been found. But the guilties have been judged, so they were underage, so they are free now. The police has not been able to find the corpse, so they haven't been able to rebuild what happened. So I think that what she is asking is, well, first of all, if you would dare to investigate a real case like this one without a solution, in order to try to look for a solution as a novelist or as a detective, and if in some of your own novels you would dare to make Dave not to find the solution of the case. I think that's what she was asking. That was her wife, I think.
The closest I could ever come to that would be fictionally to let Dave approach what the phrase in the States is cold case, a case that hasn't been solved completely, and I might in the future have Dave be working on a fictional cold case. If what you're asking is, would I want to take on the notion of Dave somehow investigating a true case, I think that's way beyond me. I make up stories. I don't solve real crimes. I'm sorry.
Bueno, yo quería saber.
Well, I'd like to ask him about his personal opinion about the relationship between the novels with movies, with cinema. We see all bestsellers taken to or be shot as movies, etc. And I'm quite surprised because his stories are much better than many movies that we can see. They haven't been shot. Is there any personal decision? I would like to know about your opinion in terms of relationship between movies and novels.
I'm hearing maybe two questions, and maybe you can clarify for me. I'm kind of hearing that you're asking whether or not the Dave Gurney novels would be made into movies, or do you just want me to comment on the difference between movies and novels?
No.
su decisión.
No, I mean, your personal opinion about the fact that many novels that are successful are filmed. I mean, there are some companies that are looking for stories, and I don't know how the copyright works in order to film their novels, okay? But I would like to know your personal opinion about the fact of, well, if you see your novels as a movie, I mean, if you think that they could be filmed, or if it is something that you do not consider adequate or correct, because you want to leave those characters in our minds so that we can watch it at a theater. I don't know if you understand myself. Yeah.
I do now. Thank you. There are some discussions underway about possible films of the Dave Gurney novels. I can't at this point make any kind of formal announcement of it, but it's conceivable that the Dave Gurney novels may be turning into films in the not too distant future. Maybe. We'll see. In terms of the, how do I feel about these characters being, essentially specified as a particular face in a movie, I don't find that to be a plus, but you see, I tell you how you're wondering how it works. Well, an author owns the copyright, and an author can sell the movie rights, the film rights. I mean, when you sign up with a publisher, you're selling them the print rights and some other things. And when you sign up with a film writer, you're selling the film and television rights. And any author can do that. And it's, it can be a complicated contract thing, but it's no big deal. The issue, though, of how one feels about that, I think it's all over the place. I think there are some authors who are so committed to the specifics of their book that it's very difficult for them to just sign the rights over to a filmmaker. There are other authors who just look at it as a simple business transaction and don't even view the movie necessarily as having anything to do with the book. You want to use these characters, we'll sign the characters over to you. The book is the book, the movie is the movie. And I guess maybe in a way I'm a little closer personally to that view of it, that it's not so much a visualization of my book. What it might be would be somebody's idea of how those ideas in that book might work best as a film. Because what works well in a book doesn't necessarily work well in a film. There's a whole lot of things you can do with a book that you can't do with a film, and vice versa. So, maybe one way of looking at it is the movie is the movie, the book is the book, and that's it. I mean, if you get, I think, tied up with, well, suppose the lead character doesn't look like what I've always thought my lead character, you're just going to drive yourself crazy.
¿Tenéis alguna otra pregunta?
Do you have any other question? Yep. Hello, good evening. I would like to know your opinion about generally speaking, the mystery novel is considered as a less important novel because the top literature spheres, so to speak, do not consider that it is good literature. I mean, it is considered as easy literature, some literature, and that's it.
¿No va a pelear más?
I have no problem with that.
¿Tenéis alguna pregunta más?
Do you have any other questions?
Bueno, son las 8:24.
Well, it's 8:24. We've been talking to John for almost 1 hour and a half. So thank you very much for coming along. For me as a reader, it has been amazing. I've read this book. I've been lucky. So I absolutely recommend it to you. To me, after think of a number, I think it's is the best novel, even maybe even better, because it is much more mature, much more reflexive. It is better written. We can see the evolution not only in terms of the detective, but also in terms of the author. It has been a great pleasure to read it, so I encourage you to read it. And now I think he will sign some copies on a table that will be around. So thank you very much to you all.
With us this
I want to
afternoon.
thank all of you. It's I feel very grateful that you took the time to come here tonight. Thank you so much.
Y espero que su mujer se lo haya pasado igual.
And I hope that your wife has had a great experience with us. Thank you very much, and a big round of applause, please.